Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Sumeracki, an associate professor at Rhode Island College. And Johanny Castillo and I, she's one of my former students at Rhode Island College, she and I just had a paper accepted in Translational Issues in Psych Science. The paper was peer-reviewed and it was accepted, but it's not even hot off the press yet. I haven't approved the proofs yet. So this is very, very brand new work that's going to be coming out online first very shortly. And I want to talk a little bit about that paper today. So what Johanny and I did was we conducted 2 experiments in live classroom settings, asking whether covert retrieval, or just bringing information to mind without overtly producing it, so no writing, no typing, no speaking about it. We asked if that covert retrieval would produce just as much learning in the classroom as overt retrieval. Some background on this, some work that I did for my master's thesis and then some others have done as well, suggested that covert retrieval was just as good as overt retrieval when we used very simple materials. So we're talking about categorized word lists, so vegetable, cucumber, simple things like that, or even just foreign language pairs. So very simple materials. We found that covert retrieval was just as good as overt retrieval. But of course, those very simple materials are not the same thing as trying to remember more complex, meaningful information like we would expect students to do in the classroom. And so Sarah Tauber and some colleagues in 2018 conducted some research in the laboratory, but using more meaningful materials. They used intro psych terms and definitions, and they asked whether covert retrieval would be just as good as overt retrieval. And they found that it wasn't. Covert retrieval, or just trying to bring the information to mind, didn't produce as much learning as overt retrieval when they had the students actually type out the information. And part of that probably is that when the students are covertly retrieving these more complex, longer concepts, they might be relying more on familiarity rather than actually articulating the information in their minds. It's very simple if I just say vegetable and give somebody a C and they've previously studied cucumber for them to just think cucumber. But thinking of a long definition, a whole sentence, is a bit more complicated. So they also found that confidence was a little bit inflated when covert retrieval was used compared to overt retrieval. And so this suggests that maybe covert retrieval isn't as good in a classroom setting with meaningful materials. Johanny and I conducted 2 experiments in the actual classroom. In one experiment, the first experiment, the students were learning biology concepts. And these were upper-level psychology students, and so the biology topics weren't really something that we were trying to learn in the classroom. They didn't have a ton of background knowledge about it, but we wanted to see whether or not the students would learn those biology concepts. And as an aside, the students weren't doing this just for the experiment. We weren't wasting class time. This was a research methods class, and so the students then worked afterwards with their own data, and so that was part of the project. So it definitely was a meaningful learning experience for them. It's just that the content of the actual text wasn't the content they were trying to learn. And in that situation, with repeated retrieval attempts of the biology concepts, covert retrieval was not as good as overt retrieval. And again, confidence was inflated. So we thought, okay, maybe we can't use covert retrieval in the classroom. We conducted a second experiment, though, where we used a cold calling procedure. And so basically what we were asking in the second experiment is if we insert questions into a lecture, and we ask students just to think about the answer to the question, and then cold call one of the students to verbally articulate the answer, is that going to help? And I think that that is still an important question because we often don't have time to stop and have the students write out their answers during a lecture, and that can kind of break the flow of the lecture. It can take up extra time, and time is important in the classroom. And of course, not everybody is lecturing all the time. I know that just straight lecturing isn't great, but breaking up those lectures with questions could be meaningful. And of course, adding some other activities into that lecture will also help with more meaningful, engaging learning. But what about inserting those questions? So we had conditions where students were listening to myself or one other instructor who was teaching the same content in their course, lecture on the content, and in the testing conditions, retrieval practice conditions, we would stop and ask a question. And sometimes the students had to stop and write out their answers. Other times we just said, think of the answer. We then cold called one of the students. We had a randomized list of the students and we just called on their name and said, answer the question out loud. And we did this to make sure that all of the students were prepared to answer, to try to kind of force them to articulate the full answer as opposed to just thinking like, yeah, I kind of know the answer to that one and moving on. When we did this, we would cold call them both in the overt and covert retrieval conditions to promote retrieval in both. We found that on an assessment test 2 days later, overt and covert retrieval produced the same amount of learning. We compared this to a no test control where we just didn't insert questions into the lecture at all. And performance was much higher in the 2 retrieval practice groups compared to that no test control. Now, of course, we're not matching for exposure in this experiment. We're adding retrieval practice into the retrieval practice conditions. We're not adding anything into that no test lecture. We're really just comparing it to a baseline. It's a very practical question. If we insert questions, do we have to ask the students to stop and write them down? Or can we use other measures to promote actual retrieval of the information, like cold calling, to improve learning during lecture content? And the answer is yeah, you can insert questions and you do not have to stop and have the students write out the answers, at least according to the results of this experiment. Of course, it would be great for us to continue to do work in this area and to see, what other aspects of cold calling might improve learning, how much cold calling is necessary, how long of answers can students covert retrieve. There's a lot of area for new research, but according to our work, which to my knowledge is the first to look at this type of thing with covert retrieval in a live classroom setting, it looks like it works just as well.